Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When Brother Hijab and co begun their dialogue with Jordan Peterson, I was glad he would finally meet the real Islam. But being aware of his talks with non-Muslims, I wasn't too optimistic. By the time he came round to talking to Muslims, I was already pretty sure we were dealing with an entrenched Western civilization supremacist. Hear me out. Jordan Peterson clearly believes in a natural selection of ideas.
Society depends for its ability to adapt to the changing horizon of the future on the free thought of the individuals who compose it. It's like a free market.
Ideas fight, and in the end, the best ideas win. Because life is a competition, you must have winners, and therefore losers. So by definition, life is cruel and hierarchical. He normally focuses on human mating patterns, but it isn't an unreasonable stretch to extrapolate that to the macro scale.
You have a dominance hierarchy, and that's really an old structure. The dominance hierarchy is 300 million years old, because it emerged pretty much whenever there was a nervous system.
In terms of the West, we're obviously talking about the Judeo-Christian values that underpin this civilization. Good ideas, or as Jordan Peterson says, good stories like those in the Bible, help us realize our higher self. For him, Western domination would be proof the West is more competent and has won the war of ideas. Another crucial point, the battle is fought by imperfect, psychologically driven animals called humans, who will do whatever it takes to reproduce, even if it means committing atrocities.
It isn't obvious that all the people involved in the Nazi movement, for example, were criminally pathological. You can get ordinary people to do that sort of thing.
He would say this is just an undesirable fallout of our complex human evolutionary process, and its validity lies in the fact that it's been happening forever.
And as far as real goes from a Darwinian sense, permanent is real.
This is the worldview of someone who sees the figure of God as a mere excretion of our psychology. You can strip it of dogma and relegate God to a symbol, albeit a powerful one, without suffering any real guilt. Religion tells us we shouldn't kill, rape or genocide, with the promise of a literal hell, although we often fail. But Jordan Peterson's God is nothing more than a useful fairy tale you consciously mould around your convenience. Although he believes in a notional hell, it's simply the hell of our making. So Auschwitz would be so evil, it literally is hell on earth. So why would someone like Jordan Peterson have no problems supporting Zionism? Yes, I know he works for the far-right Islamophobe and Jewish nationalist Ben Shapiro and the Daily Wire, but it's way more than that. For Jordan Peterson to go all in on a project, it needs to have or feel some affinity with his own way of thinking. The idea of a people and a nation-state that reaches back to the writings of the Old Testament, married to modern political theory in the form of the nation-state, is a combination that encapsulates everything that a conservative Western intellectual like Jordan Peterson values in this world. Jordan Peterson believes the individual freedoms guaranteed by a nation-state are the glorious final act and a culmination of Christ's ideas around the kingdom of heaven indwelling in all of us.
Divine sovereign individual, is that not what your culture is predicated on, that idea? The logos inherent in each person?
But it only makes sense when it harks to the original inspiration, or it lacks evolutionary depth and spiritual legitimacy.
Beginning of Genesis, for example. So imagine this divinity of the individual is rooted in the narrative conception that's part and parcel of the Judeo-Christian tradition.
So the Bible represents man's struggle to grapple with its own mortality. And with the modern nation-state of Israel, the story has come full circle. It holds up to the world what is already squandered in the West.
And there's an insistence in the US that the traditions that bind us are actually part of the oppressive problem.
The sacred in the face of the profane, the infinite reimagined before the finite, and Jordan Peterson can't get enough of this exhilarating marriage of old ideas made new, and not by accident, he'd imagine, mirroring the notion of a risen Christ who conquered death, and all this he hopes will ultimately pull up the West from its moral decline. Although ironic, it's the logos, reason, that has ultimately ensured that the Zionists have outfought the Palestinians in the realm of the spiritual.
The combination of economic power through free markets and military and intelligence power that combine to give us diplomatic power. And with that, Arab leaders in the area began to see Israel not as their enemy, but as their indispensable ally.
As well as being futile to stand before the tide of history or even God's unveiling plan, psychologically it might not be desirable either. Remember, Jordan Peterson doesn't think we are deterministic robots. 21st century man can now delay gratification and make complex long-term choices.
It's amazing. You can bargain with reality. You can forestall gratification now, and it'll pay off at a place and time that doesn't even exist yet.
And so even if there is pain in the short term, i.e. a particular group need suffer a while, our complex nervous systems allows us to correct our moral course years down the line and recoup a net overall gain. Therefore, Jordan Peterson embraces Benjamin Netanyahu despite the unavoidable stench of moral defilement, with the hope of a long-term return on his moral investment. I guess that's how Jordan Peterson would square it in his own head. And that's not just Jordan Peterson. War criminal, baby-killing far-right politicians like Benjamin Netanyahu would also be doing this kind of rationalizing in their own heads. Now, it's true, Benjamin Netanyahu isn't so clever, or should I say as careful as Jordan Peterson. Well, he's a far-right politician after all, so he kind of lets the cat out of the bag by spouting ultra-Jewish supremacist ideas. He ends up reducing the struggle to social Darwinism and, ironically, National Socialism.
Centuries later, I come back to this barren mess, this ruin, and I build it up back, and I not only improve it, I not only make my ownership based on improvement, but that nobody else did anything with it. There was no someone else. There practically were no tenants.
Right.
The best deserve to flourish, the weak don't. Precisely the justification the Nazis used in killing 6 million Jews, but whatever. The reason why Jordan Peterson doesn't push back is because for him and people like Benjamin Netanyahu, the end justifies the means. How you get to the top is purely evolutionary competence, i.e., you can't blame people for wanting to win. It's what you do when you're at the top of the status hierarchy that separates the virtuous from the not-so-virtuous.
And productive, not just powerful, right? Because the other advantage you had with the Abraham Accords was that you could present Israel as a compelling partner in economic development.
This is the precise justification Jordan Peterson makes for class hierarchies.
There are all sorts of advantages you have that other people don't have. So how do you justify it? By leading an ethical life. The issue is that's how you atone for your unearned privilege.
He isn't interested in inequalities. That's all to do with competence. Whichever way you slice and dice it, the more competent rise to the top. And this thing, he argues, is embedded into our very nervous system. Now, how Zionism won isn't important. How they consumed the Palestinians' apartheid, assassinations and war crimes isn't worth looking at. What justifies their land grab and their 1948 expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians is that they're a democracy now. They're a modern liberal nation state now. They respect the law and they're developing the land and are flourishing now.
There seems to be something intrinsic to our notion of valid ownership that if you're going to occupy a territory, you actually have to do something with it that's productive.
Whereas the Palestinians, who may indeed be true victims, and Jordan Peterson might even admit so in private, by having a regressive idea, beckon the punishment of God upon themselves.
Palestinians who want to destroy us, who support terrorism, who are anti-democratic, who are or basically neo-colonials, because they're really the colonials.
And that somehow passes on the guilt over to the Palestinians and justifies the notion that the Palestinians, on some quasi-religious sense, like the Amorites, like the Canaanites, like the Hittites of the Bible, don't deserve their own homeland.
First of all, they did nothing with the land. It's just barren. They actually built one town. It's called Ramleh. That's it.
Therefore, their suffering, however cruel, unfortunate, and barbaric, is subsumed by the greater virtue of a Judeo-Christian outpost, made more desperate by the descent of the West. It's the classic archetype of the scapegoat. Heap the guilt of centuries of Christian anti-Semitism on these Arabs. Heap the guilt of a morally failing Western civilization onto the wretched Arabs that nobody cares for, and toss them to the wilderness. It's cruel, it's heartbreaking, he might wish it wasn't so, but in the end, he'd grudgingly argue that's life. Someone needs to atone for historical mistakes. And ultimately, this is life without a real God. Deal with it.
All of us walk on blood-soaked ground because human history is, in some regards, a nightmarish catastrophe.
Once the buck has been passed to someone else, i.e. it's the Palestinian Arabs who are responsible for what's befallen them.
In fact, the refugees are the result of Arab aggression and not its cause.
Once that peace is in place, anything goes, literally. You can now shamelessly exaggerate, conceal, lie, cheat, propagandize to your heart's content without losing any sleep because you've psychologically shifted the burden of proof onto your opponents. Now they have to prove to you that they don't deserve the pain that you are inflicting on them.
When the Jews came to Israel, they were doing what they could to coexist with the people who were there.
Right.
Now, these are obviously blatant lies that can be blown apart by the most basic research, and yet it's said by a leading public intellectual thousands look up to for his motivational lectures that talk of the very principles he's trampling over in this interview. If what Jordan Peterson and Benjamin Netanyahu say is true, why did the IDF destroy 400 Palestinian towns and villages and ethnically cleanse 85 to 90% of the Palestinian Arab population from what then became Israel? From Beersheba alone, 88 villages were depopulated, with the 90,507 people expelled. From Haifa, 59 villages were depopulated, with 121,196 Arabs expelled. And as you can see here, the list goes on and on and on. So much for...
It was a barren land. It really had, practically it was an empty land.
But this is not really shocking because human beings are uniquely capable of some pretty scary stuff. No less ethical, on a lesser order of magnitude, people are more than capable of rationalizing their own lies too.
Also to set up a state that would invite other people who weren't Jewish to live there as well. So it wasn't an oppressive regime in any sense.
And yet today, there are more than 5.6 million Palestinian refugees registered with the United Nations, belying Jordan Peterson's words. This despite the adoption of the 1948 General Assembly of the United Nations Resolution 194, which affirmed the Palestinians' right to return to their homes. That Israel is preventing the Palestinians from enacting, despite having a law of return and permanent settlement for Jews only. Again, lying isn't the most shocking part here. Wallahi, it's the fact that Jordan Peterson knows that he's lying, but he does not care. Somehow he's insulated his conscience from the consequences through what psychologists would call compartmentalization. But what's far worse is he knows that everybody knows that he's lying, but it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. This is a more malevolent form of lying because it is based on the assumption that he feels he can get away with it. He feels he can rely on an army of powerful people to enable it and protect him in creating a safe space for his lies. This is a well-oiled industry of propaganda. And it's truly scary because it suggests the space we all share as humanity is not something guided by a set of objective values we might call the truth, that we can all agree and unite upon. Rather, the truth is relative, it seems. The very thing Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro rail against in the Western media and being responsible for the decline of the West. Yet when it comes to Israel Palestine, the same so-called public intellectuals will shamelessly perpetuate the same nonsense. So we see in the end, there's no material difference in outcomes anyway, between someone like the atheist Sam Harris and theists such as Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. That is, if we're willing to concede the point that they are theists at all. Atheists like Sam Harris conspicuously obliterate the idea of God and predictably feel no qualms discriminating against innocent Muslims, whereas Jordan Peterson pretends there is a God and equally discriminates against innocent Muslims. Their unfair take on the Muslim question prove that there is no moral standard that ensures the weak are protected against tyranny outside a literal conception of God. For even so-called arbitrary universal morality soon becomes a tool of man's injustice. Man needs an objective and sacred moral code to keep it in check, and anything less is insufficient window dressing. In other words, Islam is the answer. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.